It's very good to see you. I am too. I think most of you know, which is great. And this is Avi, Rabbi Avi Lesches. He's from the Chabad community in Crown Heights, and he's also the director of 5 borough initiatives at the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. We're very delighted to have him here, getting started with this interfaith conversation series that I think should be fun. I think it'll be a good way to connect with a lot of our local religious leaders, be able to talk about what they do, how they came into what they do. In this case, by vocationality, and talking about how faith intersects with business. I think it's all good stuff. So I'm excited to have this conversation. We'll go for about maybe half an hour or so. And if you guys have any questions, please be thinking about those. You can put them in the chat or, oh yeah, how is the audio? Can you hear me pretty well? It's good, okay. Okay, absolutely. Okay, is the sound getting better as I kind of go this way? Just curious if this is the microphone or is it just this way? Or is it okay? The first, I'm kind of more towards here. Okay. I'm guessing this is on then. So I'm going to put this down here. Okay. How is that? Can I get some thumbs up if we're okay? Can you hear? How about if Avi just says hello? Hello. Okay. Very good. Thank you for bearing with us and all the technology that comes with us these days. It is good. It can be a hassle, but ultimately I'm glad that we have it. So I have, several questions for Avi that I, shot him in advance, and so we'll be able to discuss those a little bit. And then, like I said, if you have any questions after that, let us know. All right. Okay. So I'm curious of how you became a rabbi. I'm just interested.
So growing up in the Crown Heights Jewish community of Chabad, most of the male students go through rabbinical seminary. So when I was finished high school, there's a choice was either to go to college or to go to rabbinical seminary. A lot of my friends went to rabbinical seminary. We started a year off in Israel, and then I finished the last 2 years in South Beach, Miami. So kind of did it because friends and family were doing it, so you kind of go along with it. Didn't really have the mission or vision to go into the pulpit or to be a practicing rabbi, but I was like, you know what? I'll do it. If it comes in handy, it comes in handy. So
It's cool.
Wasn't necessarily a calling.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my follow-ups. Was I have desire ? Did you have a
Well,
desire?
not really. No.
Okay. Did you have a different desire? Did you want to do something else?
So after finishing rabbinical seminary, they let you train under a rabbi for a year. So I got sent off to Singapore, Southeast Asia for a year. So couldn't complain. It's an amazing community. It's a very diverse community. You have Sephardic Jews who've been in Singapore from Iraqi descent for over 100 years. So it's an old established community. You have more, I would say, Western members of the Jewish community, so let's say from America, Europe, and other parts that have kind of been there for 2 years for work. And then you have a large Israeli contingent. So you have a very divergent kind of community, and the goal was to kind of work with all of them and kind of bring them together for community events and functions. So that kind of piqued my interest, saying, you know what, maybe this is not such a bad idea. This could be a lot of fun. This could be interesting. During the year, they sent us out for field assignments to to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Laos. So it kind of got to most of field experience, and I was like, you know what, maybe this could work. But at the end of the year, I was like, you know what, I want to go back to realization, go back to America for a little bit, let's see family and friends, because part of the assignment is you don't go back for a full year. So yeah, you could talk, you could see people, but it's essentially you're there in that assignment. So coming back, my friends went to college, they started to get jobs, traveling a little bit. So I was like, you know what, let me try that pivot a little bit. So that's kind of how I shifted back into that role.
Yeah, cool. Was there a particular field assignment that was kind of inspiring to you?
I think to me when we went to like Indonesia and Laos, there's no established community whatsoever. So you're kind of just given some names and addresses of people who they've come in contact with over the years. So it's really got to be an experience one-on-one where you're not necessarily leading a congregation or servicing a congregational community. You're kind of individually working one-on-one with folks on a variety of issues. And I found that to be more interesting and more exciting because you don't know what you're getting into. And also you really get to connect with people in a way that you don't really get to do through a formal setting. So say, for example, if you're doing services at the temple or whatever it is, you get to see people, you get to talk to people, but there's really not that much, maybe there's a follow-up at home, but there's really not that much of a connection after that. Whereas over here, we were able to do that in a less of a formal setting.
Makes sense. I think I'm there yet. How was it growing up? You're Brooklynite, right?
Yes,
Through and through.
born and bred.
So just how was that experience? And did it, growing up amongst rabbis in that
Right.
kind of culture, was it always something on your mind, or was just an option?
Well, not really, because growing up in the community, you see so many people going into the field of being a pulpit rabbi or service a community in some form or fashion. And to me, it was more like, that's great, but it does take a lot. There's a lot of sacrifice, whether it's the home life, the family life, social life. It does take a toll. So for me, it was more like, you know what? I don't know if I'm really to sacrifice all of that, but I wanted something in a way that I don't have to give all that up. Maybe do something kind of like less intensive. But the one thing I have to say that really kind of shifted my mindset was like growing up in Brooklyn. So you live more in I would say, a conservative community. So you don't really get to interact. Yeah, we have our neighbors who we interact with, you say hello to, but you don't really get to know them in a very personal level. And what I liked about the Singapore experience was that the rabbi the government, I would say, is very involved in interfaith. It's kind of part of like the community and the fabric of the government is that all the religious leaders have to get together once a month. It's not like an option where you get to say, okay, today I want to do it. No, it's kind of required. And what I found interesting is that all of the middle school and high schools in Singapore, both state and private, have to do an interfaith lesson. So they take the kids on a field trip to a different religious center where they have to learn about another faith and do a report about it. So the kids get exposed to something that they're not used to, familiar with. And so the rabbi being, with all his duties and responsibilities, he was like, you know what, I'm kind of pawning it off to you. So I became the go-to person dealing with the interfaith responsibilities and the interaction with the youth. I found that very interesting because to me, it was more about learning about different cultures and different religions that I may not have experienced back in Brooklyn. So I got to learn about what a Taoist is, a Buddhist, Zen, the people who follow the fire, Zero. Yes. The different levels of, even I know like in Christianity, you have, the Baptists, you have the Catholics, and you have different other faiths within that. But you got to experience and meet folks from them and learn a little bit about their religion from those people, which I probably would have had.
Have any of the practices that you saw or philosophies that you kind of learned about, has that influenced your own faith at all or practices?
It did, because I found one thing which was interesting. Across all faiths, there was one thing that kind of spoke unanimously between all of them, and that was the fact that we're all human. We all come from the same cloth. We may have different practices, different beliefs, different philosophies, but at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is we want to live a healthy lifestyle, a safe lifestyle. We want to be able to enjoy our lives and practice to an extent. Some people who weren't too religious, still believe in something of a higher power, and they wanted the world to be a better place better than how they found it. So, which means that our descendants should find a much better world compared to the way we came into the world. And that I found interesting because it's like that common thread is something that everybody wants. No matter, so we may have different ways how we get there, but the goal is ultimately the same.
Very good. You mentioned the many duties and responsibilities of the rabbi and how he kind of delegated that portion to you.
Right.
As a rabbi now, what are some of your responsibilities and duties?
So mostly in the community, a few years ago, my synagogue decided to open up a preschool. Kind of because there's young families growing. I would say it's a little bit different to some other communities. For example, in Williamsburg and Borough Park, most families have 10 plus children. The generation that I'm from, it's more like 3 or 4 children. It's a very different shift. And I think it's coming down to the fact that raising a family today in 2021 is not cheap. It's very expensive. Housing is expensive, cost of living is expensive, and then you pay private tuition, right? So that in itself has added an additional burden. So a lot of the people in the community were like, they're both parents are working, they want to, be able to afford a comfortable lifestyle, but they don't want to go broke. So he kind of came to the rabbi and synagogue was like, let's do something a little different. Let's try to create it wasn't a closed preschool, more of a play group for the synagogue members, for the families. And so they established that. At that time, I was serving as assistant rabbi president. And so we started it. It started off with about 20, 30 kids. And today it's kind of pivoted into its own little school where it has 100 kids, all the way up to third grade. And the one thing I would say is unique is that there's two elements that's incorporated into education, which is there's a healthy dose of secular education. So most of the religious schools in our community do not really teach more. They teach like very basic math, English, and very basic science. The school that we've been able to establish is like literally 50-50. So you would say 50% of the day is religious studies and 50% of the day is secular studies. And it kind of, there's a cohesive relationship between the two. So that's kind of been our responsibility the last few years, is helping make sure that that school thrives and succeeds.
Excellent. Nice. Well, I'd say that's a good transition to thinking about, saying there's kind of this relationship between the two and secular and religious.
Right.
You're bivocational, you've got your work at the chamber and your work as a rabbi. How did you get into working at the chamber? What was that process like?
So coming back after finishing rabbinical seminary and going to college, I went to Torah College, got a BA in political science and international relations. That kind of is a pivot. A lot of people in that field go into law. And this is in 2009, 2010, after the crash. A lot of my friends were coming out of law school. They're like, don't go to law school. There's no jobs at the other end of the line. So don't even bother. So I was like, okay, I'll wait it out a little bit. The synagogues in Brooklyn weren't really, they were just like starting out. Like in our community today, we have 60 small, I would call small mom and pop synagogues, which means a lot of the guys coming out of seminary or school or college are like, we don't want to go to the main synagogues. We don't want to really go with our fathers. We want to have our own little synagogue, our own little social club, if you want to call it. And so it's kind of sprung organically, where today you have 20 of the established synagogues in the communities, and then 40 that have kind of splintered out and opened their own synagogues. And so, for example, the synagogue that I'm a member of has, on an average weekend, almost 100, attendees. And it's growing and thriving. They have an annual budget of almost $200,000, so I'm saying, so there's a lot of momentum, especially in the young generation, to kind of make something different than what we grew up with. There's very much a big focus on element of kids programs and educational and youth. So after finishing college, I was looking for something in the private sector because there wasn't none of the pulpit rabbis, if you want to say, were actually getting paid a lot. There wasn't really an opportunity there. So I went to work as a paralegal for a real estate firm here in Brooklyn, and kind of was going to wait it out till I go to law school. And then a friend of mine called me up and said, the chamber has something that's kind of a pivot of both, because I want something in politics, which I enjoy, but also at the same time in public sector. And the chamber kind of does both of that. It's a private entity, but it's there to help the public sector. It works with the public sector to help the private sector. And so I've been there for now 8 years.
How has your role progressed over those years? Has it changed?
So I remember when I started out, I was doing merchant organizing, just helping local merchant groups and small businesses with a variety of needs, to then eventually pivoting and showing our, like families like TD Bank or different other private institutions and foundations that the small business community and as the chamber, both as a group, both not just Brooklyn, but citywide, can come together and really make an impact on the small business community, especially those who are, in the Latino community, the Black community, the Asian community, who don't necessarily trust government and don't know how to access all these resources. How do we bring them the access in a way that we could be beneficial to them? And so that was one of the things that the chamber did, is we created this 5-chamber alliance where we got funding at the initial start from TD Bank and some other private foundations to really go out and bring resources to the business community in a way that it goes through the chamber. So the chambers, like in the Bronx, know how to interact with the South Bronx, and you have a chamber. We would reach out to parts like Coney Island, Bay Ridge, Bed-Stuy, East New York, all those different neighborhoods to make sure that the resources are getting into the neighborhood and working with local groups on the ground to making sure that, okay, how we reach those businesses on the day, whether it's going door to door, whether it's actually engaging them on doing an event for the community, stuff like that. So in a sense, it's kind of pivoted back to what a rabbi is, which is like you're kind of caring for your flock. You're kind of making sure that your constituents and your members have what they need in order to grow and thrive. So in a religious setting, it would be mostly about making sure that the religious responsibilities are taken care of, and if there's any, financial or spiritual stuff, emotional stuff, you could be there to support them. And to me, it's the same concept in working small business community, because they're kind of your flock, your people, you're taking care of them.
Yeah, I like that. I just wrote that down. I was like service oriented.
Correct.
A
Yeah.
lot of these themes.
Yeah.
Looking at that, I think that's great. Do you have sort of a favorite part of each of your responsibilities of being a rabbi and working at the chamber?
I think it's a one-on-one interaction. Nothing can beat that. I think just sitting down, whether it's dealing with an individual or family, that has a kid that could be going through something, or dealing with a business, the one-on-one interaction, it's like a human-to-human level. And there's nothing, I don't think anything can ever beat that, because it really connects to humans in a way that you're there to help them and listen to them and supporting them in shape, way, or form. And it's the same way that vice versa. By you being able to help them, they in turn will help somebody else. It's I feel like it's giving forward, paying it forward, if you want to say that.
Excellent. Are there any other ways? I mean, my next question is, how does your faith intersect your work? I mean, you've already kind of explained that in a lot of ways.
One of the things that's funny you say this, because one of the things some of my friends and colleagues who are not necessarily, who are working mostly in the religious world, will say to me, how can you do what you do in a way without compromising? Well, I'm like, if you believe in what you believe and you hold strong in your beliefs and you don't compromise, well, obviously there's room for compromising in any shape, way, or form. But in general, let's say, for example, we'll host events sometimes in non-kosher restaurants, right? So me, as somebody who practices kosher, I just won't eat, right? I'll drink, I'll schmooze, I'll have a good time with the people, but I just won't eat. But that's my choosing, right? So I'm not forcing that anybody else making it. And I always tell the hosts and the guests, don't worry, I had a late lunch, I'm good. You don't want them to feel bad.
Yeah.
And so I feel like if you're kind of conscious and aware of yourself, of okay, this is what I'm going to, but I'm not going to impose it or make other people feel uncomfortable with it, you're going to be good. And I feel like the problem is that sometimes we feel that a lot of people, even in religious settings, we're trying to kind of pacify everybody and trying to make sure everybody's taken care of, but sometimes realizing maybe like we're pushing it a little too much. I try to be like, I'm good, don't worry about me. I'm totally comfortable. And I think that, in a sense, by being confident and comfortable in your own setting and your own who you are as a being, that's not going to interfere with anything else.
Is it common to be bivocational? Like, is it?
No,
it's not.
unfortunately, no. Growing up, the school that I went to did not really teach us mostly. They taught, like I said, there was like maybe 2 hours in the afternoon we got between math and English and a little bit of science. But it's not a lot, thinking of growing up and then going into college. It was a little bit of a struggle, but the good thing is that my parents at home and a lot of my colleagues and friends growing up had, I would say tutors that taught us, secular vocational secular studies. So one of the things that's when we started school, I said we have to incorporate a healthy dose of both, because you don't want to create a second generation that struggle. Now, I know there've been articles and books and saying how, I came from a grade of 75 kids, right? I would say pretty much every single one of them has a job. Some of them are college grads, some of them became doctors, lawyers, different professions. They've all found a way to make themselves a way in the world. I have yet to see somebody who really, don't get me wrong, there were those who struggle, but everybody struggles in their own way. But I think overall, everybody came out of the system in a way that they knew they had to make something of themselves. So they all went in different paths and chose whatever they did. Some of them became entrepreneurs, started their own businesses, and some of them went into the professional career. So that's one of the things why we push to at least adopt a 50-50 vocational setting, so that we create the setting that the kids don't have to worry and have private tutors at home. And because again, these students are coming home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? So when I was a kid, we would have from, let's say, 4:30 till about 6:30, 2 hours of secular studies with a tutor. That's a long day for any kid. So by doing this in a way, you're not really, the kids get to come home, they get to enjoy themselves, be a kid, hang out with friends and stuff like that.
Nice. I think it's it. In terms of, so these two different roles you have, talk about liking a lot of things about both of them. How's the balance? Do you feel like one of them kind of creeps more in on the other and it makes it harder to do one, or is it?
It sometimes does.
Yeah.
It does sometimes conflict one with the other, but I've learned over the years, time management is really key. And if you're able to say, okay, this is what I have to do today, and this is the goal, and you set a set time for it, you're able to get it done. You know, I find personally over the years that if you overextend yourself and trying to take on too much and try to stick it all into one, it doesn't get done.
Yeah.
So I try to, at least for myself personally, is that, you know, the night before, okay, say what's to accomplish, what's the tasks for tomorrow, and kind of structure my day a little bit around that, and then it seems to work a lot better.
Time check. Okay, we got about 17 more minutes scheduled. Let me just look at that real quick. Okay. Okay. Brief intermission. Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to share before I open it up to questions from everyone?
No, I think the one thing I've always learned from my experience is to be happy and healthy in who you are and what you do, and, you know, never let others kind of, you know, tell you otherwise or try to convince you that you're doing is the right or wrong thing. I think at the end of the day, a person has to feel that whatever they choose in life, whatever religion, whatever path, it's that path. And, you know, obviously we can all use a little bit of, you know, criticism, what I would say constructive criticism to help us get to where we need to go. But try to look in the positive versus negative. You know, there's always a joke of saying that the glass is always half full or half empty. I try to always look at it as half full. Yeah. So I think with that type of dose of attitude, I think, you know, it does help try to bring people more together.
Well, I can always come back in for some more questions myself, but I wanted to open it up to Sue or Aaron or Liz or Ben or Alan. If you had any questions, I see one in the chat. Yeah. Anybody?
I got growing up, you grew up in a black hat kind of community, correct? Rather than a modern Orthodox. How do you align the two, coming from the black hat and an Orthodox, a modern Orthodox community? How has that affected your viewpoint?
So I think the viewpoint, as I mentioned earlier, is that it comes from a very conservative background. And so obviously when I get to travel the world, you get to see, well, there's other sides of, there's shades of gray and the shades of blue. And so it does help shape your thinking and realizing that, you know, there's a little more outside the world beyond what we see in our community. And so in the community today, I would have to say a lot of the people of my age who are, I would say black hatters, they're still black hatters, but they're a little more open-minded. You know, they've gone to college, they've read, they've been exposed to different things. So like the younger generation, I think, is becoming more adaptable to the world around them. But at the same time, they're not compromising certain beliefs that they have. So you're trying to build a healthy balance between the two. It's not always easy. It's a struggle, but again, that's life. Life is full of struggles.
Another question in terms of extremes. I take a look at the numbers of the conservative types of Jewish communities that are out there. Those numbers are dwindling now. They seem to be going to either the Reform or the more up. Do you see that split, or am I just, or it's really occurring?
That's actually correct. That's something we've seen over the years. All the travels I've been to, it seems to be more and more, because I feel like a lot of the folks my age, a little younger, are like, you know, they either want to be more liberal in the sense of Judaism, more traditional, if you want to say, like culturally, but then there are those who say, you know what, if I'm going to do it, I want to go all the way in. I want to lean in. And so therefore they go to the more conservative side. The one thing I would tell you, which is actually interesting, even within the conservative, if you want to say the ultra-Orthodox or the Orthodox setting, they themselves have had a shift. You know, like for example, as I said earlier, the synagogues, like if you come to our synagogue, they have a women auxiliary that's extremely active. in leadership roles and in running programs and speaking at events, which is a little unheard of for the ultra-Orthodox world. So in the Orthodox world themselves, there's a form of modernization that's happening, I would say a little relatively quietly, but it's there.
So it's sort of like going back to the old days when we started out in the small, well, go back to a term, from the small steebles, the type of approach, the small approach. Then we went to the large synagogues. Looks like we're going back to the future,
Yeah,
all the way back again. And you find that healthy, or?
I think it is, because when you have a small shtivel, when you're in that small little setting, you get to know the people in your community, you get to know one another, you get to rally around another. Like when we had friends of ours who, unfortunately, in circumstances, the entire community came together to help them. And like a meeting, we didn't necessarily reach out to the whole community, but our little synagogue came together and raised, like our rabbi got married. He married off one of his daughters. So he doesn't make a lot of money. So he needed the community raised between themselves $30,000 to help cover the wedding. So that I'm saying, like, it's those type of small little things where the community, I would call it a community within a community. So these little synagogues are kind of self-sufficient, they're self-reliant, and they're self-sustaining themselves.
Do you find that very difficult to sustain financially, or?
The question is now, a lot of the young folks are younger in their careers, so it is a little challenging. The question becomes, once they get older and they start to retire and all of that, like what happens then? That will be, I think, the big test. I think what we've seen is that the older synagogues have kind of faded and kind of went away because they didn't have a system of sustainability. Like people just said, I'm done with it, I'm moving on. Where the younger ones, they feel passionate about it. So the question is, will that passion still be there in 10 to 15 years from now?
Thank you. Interesting.
No problem.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, the world these days is kind of unsettled, a little bit dark, but you see a lot of uncomfortable situations out there. How do you maintain spiritual joy or joy within the community? What do you do to nourish that feeling and that
So it's
sense of
funny.
optimism and happiness?
See, it's funny you mentioned that, because we had this discussion over the weekend. We had somebody who was going through a really tough time. He was going through a bit of divorce and he was a little down. And we were just talking about it over the weekend, just like one-on-one. And the one thing I told him is that I always look at it this way. If you look at nature, right, there's always a night and there's always a morning, no matter what. No matter how dark it'll be, no matter how bad of a storm it will be, the sun will always rise the next morning, no matter where you are in the world. So my attitude has always been, yes, whatever we're going through life right now, whatever the world is going through right now, right, it is always going to be another day tomorrow. The sun will always come up. I'm always going to be that optimist. And I tell people, like, it's funny because I was telling this rabbi, he's like, America right now is in a really dark place. I'm like, I don't know if I could agree with that, because if I know a little thing about history, from what I've known, the Vietnam era seems to be a really dark period in American history. And somehow we've seemed to have gone beyond that. So I think with, again, a healthy dose of optimism is that, unfortunately, we go through these periods. Why and how, that's a very good question. I'll leave that to the powers that be to figure that out. But I think us as people, we have to always realize we have to do our best to just get through this. And just know that at the end of the day, no matter what storm, no matter what comes our way, there will always be another day tomorrow, no matter what. It's not always easy. It's going to be hard in the moment to know that there's light at the end of that tunnel. But if you tell yourself, just like when you go through a long night when you can't sleep and you're trying everything, eventually the sun comes up and that's it. The day begins. So I think you have to take that same attitude that you just got to push yourself going forward.
Sort of a follow-up to that, do you have a particular verse of scripture that's kind of inspired you over the years that you come back to?
Yeah, there's so many of that. I think the best one I saw recently, I was actually going through the old prophets, kind of randomly over the summer. And if you read through end of Jeremiah and the end of Ezekiel, they always talk about, there's always tragedies and death and, not happy times. But they always talk about that there will be a tomorrow. So they talk about, Ezekiel talks about the dry bones and how he kind of revived that whole thing. And then he saw the fiery chariot and all these other things and even Jeremiah, for example, during his lifetime, he was chastised and ostracized for everything he said. But then if you look at the end of his life, he talks about a whole new awakening and he was how respected and he helped lead kind of the establishment of the Jewish community in Babylon when the temple was destroyed. So I think that whole, I won't say there's a verse, but that whole, I get to say, part of scripture that talks about in the worst of the worst time, there was always that ray of hope. There was always, okay, this is what it's going to be. Now, how do we go about it in a way to make things settle? And I think the best example of that is the story of a rabbi in the time of the second temple destruction. He went to Vespasian, who was then the Roman general, and he said, look, I'm not coming here to try to save Jerusalem from being destroyed, but I ask you as a favor to allow us to establish our rabbinical academy outside the city in Yavna. And that to me is the epitome, is that even in the midst of the destruction, right, he had an opportunity to talk to the Roman general and say, look, ask me whatever you know, granted. He didn't ask for this city because he knew the city was gone. He said, where's the future going to be? And the future is going to be is education, is going to be continuity, and all of that. And so I think that that's what we have to always focus on, is that even in the darkest moment, there has to be a focus on continuity and where do we go as a people, both as a faith and as a society.
I see that coming through in what you're doing now, you know, and the focus on education, and,
Yeah.
you know, trying to build that. That's great. That's great. All right.
Just got a quick question.
Yeah.
if you don't mind. Rabbi, when you were out there, and that terrain is unforgiving out there in Laos.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've been to Korea and what were some of the common threads that you would share with the community so that they could feel unified with you?
So it was mostly about commonality. So some of them were Americans. So like obviously, you know, oh, what's going on at home? I miss a good burger, you know, like just like as talking as Americans. But then there were those who actually were from either Europe or other parts, or even from Asia, like who grew up in Asia, just moved from Singapore or from this big Jewish community in Hong Kong, and they just moved over to Laos. Was that they just as a human commonality say, hey, you're a farmer, so tell me a little bit about how you go about your day. How do you, you know, do your rice patties, and just showing interest in what they are doing, just as being a connection to show that you actually care, you actually are interested. And then once you start from there, it kind of dovetails into its own. We've had great conversations about philosophy, one with one individual, another individual is a whole great conversation about the differences, if you want to say, the mysticism in Judaism and the mysticism in some Eastern religions. So I would say the terrain, like I said, it's really the one-on-one individuality really helps bring a level of connection that you may not get in a much larger setting. And so like each case was different.
Thank you for your perspective. Appreciate it.
Any final thoughts, anyone? Yeah. Nothing more from me other than many thanks. Oh, Ben, maybe?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I always find interesting is, you know, I was raised Catholic and I married someone who has an Episcopal priest as a father. And, you know, like, so my fairly limited experience you know, being raised in Ohio really is that once I moved to Brooklyn, Rabbi Serge Lip here in the neighborhood is close with my wife and father-in-law. But I've had extensive conversations with my father-in-law about, you know, the challenges of clergy in Catholicism and that sacrifice that's made to, you know, being unable to be married and have a family and the financial challenges that come with that. So I always enjoy hearing about, I guess, like many other religious professional options to pursue, I guess, a more typical lifestyle, but also have, you know, whether you're fulfilling a calling or just, you know, embracing spirituality and helping others get where they'd like to be.
Right.
So I guess that's not really a question, just an observation or a thought.
I should have said questions, comments, concerns, you know, the whole gamut of things. We're always down for everything. So thanks, Ben.
But the one thing I will tell you, I learned over the years, is that you don't really even have to be a religious leader or have a congregation to do something. It's simple acts. Like, you know, the other day I was with a friend of mine who went out to Starbucks, and simply in line, a woman was in front of us. actually two people ahead of us, and the woman who was at the counter, just like you realized that the person behind them was a little elderly. She's like, you know what, I'm paying for the person behind me, right? So it's small acts like this where the person in front didn't know the person behind them, didn't care to really bother and chit chat with them, but just said, you know what, I'm gonna pay something forward. It's small things, holding a door for someone. It's small things like that where you can really make an impact on a person's day. And, you know, and I've heard countless stories where somebody was like, you know, was kind of depressed, and he's like, you know, I was in the subway and I was just like having a bad day. And then somebody just was holding the door for me and said, have a great day, right? That small little smile made a huge impact on an individual who's having a really crappy day. So that's what I'm saying. I always tell people, you don't necessarily have to be a faith leader to impact people. You can literally do it by just small acts.
Yes, I've got one more question now based on that. Just thinking, so Avi and I excuse me, bonded at the beginning because we both have Blackberries still, right? So we're kind of, you know, not as advanced maybe as some might think, but that's Blackberry right there. Okay? So it just makes me think about those interactions, you know, community,
Right.
and what are your thoughts on technology affecting, you know, that, I don't know, that conviviality and congeniality, you know, amongst people. See, so
So I would say for us in the, and this is, I think Alan was asking that earlier, is that in the Orthodox community, it's a challenge, right? So like, for example, like in the Jewish community of Williamsburg, Borough Park, Muncie, Monroe, like that, but they will not embrace technology, period. Like if you have a smartphone, you're kind of ostracized. It's like
Yeah.
really bad.
Yeah.
In my community, it's the opposite. Like, you know, people have TVs, they have iPads, they have access to Netflix and Hulu and all the other streaming devices. But what I've learned is that it can also be destructive for kids, right? So like for adults, we want to enjoy, we want to be able to engage and have access to things and educate ourselves and be knowledgeable of different things. But for kids, it's something that could be, you got to limit that, right? So I know, like, for example, like my son, like he's limited and only to maybe 1 hour a day. I don't try to let him do more than that because I know once he has more than that, that's it, they become a zombie. But it's actually funny because it's interesting how, like, even today mainstream media has kind of adopted the interest of the Orthodox community. Like you have My Unorthodox Lifestyle by the woman who's in the fashion, I forgot her name. And it was funny because in the community, everybody watched it, but everybody was kind of upset about it. Which is like, you know, the funny part is like, oh wait, how do you watch it? Oh, I have Netflix. You know what I mean? Like, it was like a big to-do. Like everybody was aware of it. And just stuff like that, because I think it's a good thing, because what it does is it helps create a conversation of being like, wait, that's not really portraying who the community is. It's portraying an iota of a segment of a community that doesn't represent the entire community. So technology is a good thing because it's able to bring the message out, it's able to bring people together, it's able to help people understand who you are and what you are. But I think it has to be done in moderation. Because again, you don't want to be too excessive and you don't want to have too little. You want to have just the right amount. And so it's a challenge to find out what's that moderation.
yeah, absolutely. Moderation, balance. I think that's a good theme of the conversation today. You know, thinking about bivocationality and the balance there, and sort of the religious and secular education elements and everything, trying to have a good balance. It's great. All right. That is gonna conclude us. So we still have Ben and Liz. Thanks so much for tuning in. Aaron, thanks for
Yeah,
being
my
here as
pleasure.
well.
Thank you very much.
Avi,
Appreciate it.
thank you so much.
No problem.
Very good.
Thank
to
you.
have here.
Thank you.
Stay in touch.
Yeah, so yeah.
Will do.